I've been asked a few times to share a little bit about making a flip nose, tilt front end type build. So I'm going to try and make a video here and see if I can help some people. My co-workers come to see what I'm doing. This is the 66 Malibu SS from Revell that comes as a tilt nose front end. This one's missing the hinge that goes on the bumper, but it's basically a bar with some pins that fit in here, and the way it's designed is the tilt mechanism can pull forward and then drop down in these little holes, which is pretty nice. And then on the hood itself there's some pins, kind of like hood pins, that fit in holes in the body. And then another thing you'll probably notice, the fenders are cut off. Just the lower portion stays on the car. So this was my very first tilt front end I did as a kid, and basically it's a pretty crude one, but I just made some homemade brackets, pins, and they sit in a little notch in the chassis. If I can do this with one hand. So it doesn't even have really a functional hinge, but this one was a little bit of a challenge because the door is still open, so I had to make door hinges as well. So there's a lot of different options out there on how you can do it. Like I said, this one was probably my first one ever, and it's pretty crude. I do like the Revel fender option. This is a promo of a 59 Ranchero that I've been working on, and so I kind of copied that same idea. Keep the bottom of the fenders because they curl in and catch if you don't do that. So some of mine are pretty tricky. This hinge is fairly simple. Because it was a promo, it had a screw-on bumper. I made the front frame rails myself, and then I just used some plastic styrene tube with a pin through it, basically. So it's pretty crude, but it works. So that's one of the options, and it's functional, easy. Again, depends on what the kit you're. There's a couple more that I've done. This one, again, part of the learning curve. As you can see, when you tilt it down, the curvature of the lower fender wants to catch on things, so it makes it a little tricky. I also did that one where the hood still would work if the front end was down, but it's hard to see in there. But the hinge mechanism, a little more similar to the Revel design so that it can move and slide. So there's a bunch of different ways you can make a hinge, and I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong way, just whatever works with the particular fender style that you have. This is another one, and again, you can kind of see some of my learning curve here. Again, the fenders, lower fenders, I've kept on the body instead of on the tilt front end. Makes it much easier to function. Again, the hinge mechanism is basically just a tube. Let's see if I can point with this screwdriver. Just a tube here with a pin going through it. And then I made some stops on it so it wouldn't tilt too far. You can kind of see right there the stop, so that it won't flip all the way over. Hopefully that shows up. But again, bunch of different ways you can do it. This is another one that has the functioning doors, and there's it's kind of unglued. There's a bunch of tutorials on how to do that. This one was also a straight axle that I made that steers. The biggest challenge probably for most people will be cutting the tilt front end away and then making some sort of a firewall. This one's not super detailed. I just filled in the gaps that were left by cutting out the inner fenders of the original kit. This one I tried to replicate a little more of what an actual 57 Ford would look like, but then of course it also made it more difficult to function. I would need two hands to really make it work, but anyway, you get the idea. That's why now I kind of like to take this lower fender and leave it on the car so that it's a lot easier for it to work. And then I probably wouldn't do this again where the hood can open when the front end is shut. Like this one here, it's all solid one piece. But anyway, a couple of different options. This is another one that I should have left the lower fender on the body because it's very difficult to do, and I probably can't even do it with one hand, but I did want to point out kind of my hood pin arrangement. So one of the things that I liked about the Revel kit was the hood kind of locked in place. Again, it's kind of tricky to do. I got loose parts here. This one has kind of like hood pins in the cowl area so that it locks the front end in place. So that's kind of a neat feature that I liked doing. So here's a better view of that. I just put some pins in the cowl area and then modified the fenders to accept the hood pins. The hinge mechanism, again, pretty simple. This just has kind of some plates with a pin in it on the front frame, and then I put some stops to keep it from tilting too far forward. Now this particular Mustang, again, you'll notice really should have left the lower fenders on the car. This is the Revel Boss 429 kit. It was a fairly thick plastic, so it took a lot of time to cut through. I use this knife, which is probably not the safest method, but I just repeatedly score on the back side, or I mean on the front side where the mold lines are, until I can see it break through to the back side. And then once you kind of get it where the knife's starting to come through, then I work on another area. And then once I get kind of the whole thing cut away, you can kind of work it, just kind of bend it a little bit and break it away, and then just kind of sand it smooth. There may be other methods, but that's how I do it, and it works pretty well. Again, thicker bodies are much more time consuming. Some of the AMT bodies are a little thinner and easier to cut through, but I do understand there are hot knives, and you could use a Dremel cut-off wheel, and if you had two bodies, and you could just cut it and sand it and then cut the other one. But I try to not cut up too many bodies unless I have a bunch of junk ones. But anyway, there's a couple of thoughts on that. This is a Revel Street Fighter that I'm collecting parts to restore, but just again, nothing really original. I try to copy what works well, and again, you'll notice the Revel use these kind of hood pins in the body to kind of lock it in place. And then here's a pretty simple hinge mechanism that would be fairly easy to copy. I just got the one part on there for this video, but you could see how simple that would be. Excuse me. Now again, with fenders like this where they're either pretty straight or they stick out, you can keep the whole fender together. But when they curl in like this Mustang body, I'd highly recommend leaving the lower part of the fender on the body. As I've learned, it's tricky to do, so if you're going to make it open and close where you can show it off, it'd be better to have this style of fender kept the lower part on there. So just some more thoughts. Get a body that has a pretty flat fender or even sticks out a little bit like this. No big deal to keep it all together. I'll show another one here in just a minute. This is an AMT kit that was made again with a tilt front end, and again you can kind of see where having some way to lock in the hood into the body once it's done. This one again a little tricky with just one hand, and you can kind of tell again with the fenders catching on stuff. There we go. But you can see this is the AMT style hinge, which is pretty easy to copy, and it works. Like I said, again with fenders that kind of curve in, it might be easier to leave this lower portion on down here, but this was actual kit, came this way, so you can see even the kit designers decided to leave the full fender there, and it does work if you got two hands. It's hard to do with one hand, but it'd be a lot easier if the fender was cut here and this lower part stayed with the cab. But it gives you again an idea of how to make some hinges. Pretty simple design, again, just a tab there with a pin on the frame. Pretty easy to copy. The way this hinge works, you'll notice it has slots in it, so when you're trying to tilt the front end, I don't know if I can do this with one hand, but the front can lift up off this point here, and so when it's tilted forward it sits a little better, and that makes it sometimes easier to pop open. But they can work with just a straight hinge as well, but again, if you're just getting ideas, the hinge is probably one of the more tricky parts that you got to fabricate if you're doing it to a kit that wasn't originally a tilt front end. So just again some more ideas on how that might work. This is a Malco Gasser Mpc Kit originally. This one I did a little more of a Shelby look to it. So I actually took an AMT 68 Shelby front clip and modified it to make a tilt front end. So I did use the MPC hinges. It's broke there from using it, but again, you can see how the hinges have slots in them so the hood mechanism can move. Again, this is another one with the curved in fenders, which makes it really tricky to do with one hand, but it does work. So let me put this on, I'll be right back. Okay, so this might be a little easier to see, but you can See how that is designed to move, so when it's open it'll kind of hold it in position, so it kind of works as a stop, and then it also makes it easier because you're moving it away from the body to tilt it forward. So that's one way to make a hinge that could function a little easier. Again, a little hard to do with one hand, but by having it slide forward, those lower corners still catch in this area, but having it move forward makes it easier to work. Again, with two hands it's not too bad, but I'd still recommend all my future ones I've been doing, or more recent ones, I've been cutting that lower fender off. So, but anyway, again, just kind of see how this was just cut away, and again, this was easy because I wasn't using the back half of the body, so I didn't have to be so careful around the door area, and the hood I glued in place, you know, so it's all solid. I did try to make the vents functional, so I took a lot of material off, so it's not real pretty. I should probably paint that flat black in there. But anyway, another idea, you know, where you can kind of steal stuff that works from a kit and make your own. So again, just kind of showing this hinge. Guess you can see in there very well. But there's basically an L-shaped notch. So when the hood is shut, it's all the way back against the body. Again, even the Malco Gasser Mpc didn't fit very well, so mix matching the AMT body to the MPC wasn't a horrible stretch. In the real world, the body lines would match much closer between a Mustang and a Chevy because they use the same fenders. But anyway, can't emphasize enough, this would be a lot easier if I had maybe taken the MPC lower fender and left that attached somehow down here. They're straighter on the MPC Malco Gasser front end, but there's several different versions of the front end for the Malco Gasser kit. The original one had kind of a 66 nose with a 67 or 8 body, which is what this one was, and that's why I went with the 68 Shelby. I thought that would look more appropriate. But anyway, another tilt front end option is mix two different bodies together to come up with something. This is another one that was pretty tricky. This is the Revel 57 Chevy. The fenders were pretty flat, so I didn't have to modify that too much. It still, as you can see, is a little tricky to get past the hinge area, but it works pretty good. And again, the hinge is a pretty simple hinge, just a tube and a pin with some plates, so pretty easy. And then kind of finally, this is a monogram GTX that I used, the 66 Malibu chassis. I did put a Mopar engine in it, but basically reused all of the stuff from the 66 Malibu, and this is an example of one where I did the fenders, where I kept the lower half here, so it makes it really easy to do. And the hinge, like I said, I just reused the monogram hinge from the Revel kit, the 66 Malibu. So you can see a lot of different ways to do it. Like as before, the hardest part maybe is the hinge to fabricate, but as far as cutting goes, just take your time, be patient, score along those lines, and you can see it doesn't look perfect, but I'm obviously not a professional YouTuber or model builder, so for me it's okay. Hope this helps a little bit. Thanks for watching.